$100,000. That is the exact price my parents put on my betrayal. While they are currently sipping champagne on a luxury European river cruise with my struggling brother, I am standing in the kitchen of the Oak Brook estate I pay for, staring at a list of chores they left for me, right next to the orchids I'm expected to keep alive. I am a senior clinical research director. I spend my days managing life-saving trials for cancer patients. Yet for 15 years, I've been an invisible figure living in a cinderblock basement room beneath the polished oak floors of this house. My name is Julianne Vance, and I just discovered that my family didn't just use me. They stole my identity, forged my signature for a six-figure loan, and decimated my credit score. For over a decade, I chose to keep my mouth shut. I told myself it was for the family, that because they raised me, it was only natural for me to shoulder the finances of this house after my father's early retirement. But if you grew up in a family that values keeping the peace, you know exactly what that costs. It doesn't bring gratitude. It only creates a habit of being used. It all started to become clear on a gray Wednesday in December when my mother, Margaret, walked into my office without knocking. She never knocked. She placed a yellow sticky note on my $3,000 laptop and tapped it with her manicured spa nail. In a tone as casual as the weather, she told me the whole family was leaving for Europe tomorrow because my brother, Grant, needed a break after a hard year at his luxury real estate firm. I would be the one staying behind to watch the house, take care of our old dog Molly, and make sure the orchids didn't die. I was so stunned I couldn't speak. Not because I wasn't invited, I was used to being excluded, but because she said it right after I had just paid for an $8,000 roof repair out of my personal savings. I looked at the list of errands, from picking up their dry cleaning to shoveling snow, all handed to me like a birthright, while my 34-year-old brother, whose luxury SUV insurance I still pay, was off to enjoy 5-star service in France. That night, listening to the ruffling of suitcases above my basement ceiling, I accidentally received a forwarded email notification from my father's account. Attached was a file I was never supposed to see, a receipt for $100,000. My heart hammered against my ribs when I saw the American Express Platinum line with the last 4 digits of a card I didn't even know I possessed. It had been opened using my Social Security number 6 years ago, the same year my mother convinced me to give up my own apartment to care for my sick grandmother. I thought about Grandma. I spent 5 years pulling double shifts at work and then staying awake through the night to feed her and change her bandages. My mother promised it would all be worth it. But when Grandma passed, the only thing I inherited was a pile of bills, while my brother received a trust fund to start his career in Chicago. I opened my FICO credit report on my laptop, my hands trembling so hard I missed the password twice. When the screen loaded, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My credit score, something I had always taken such pride in, had plummeted. There were overdue mortgage payments and 3 different maxed-out Chase Sapphire cards, all registered to this house, yet I hadn't seen a single statement in 10 years. They had stolen my future to furnish their glamorous life, turning me into a debtor while I thought I was the pillar of the family. I looked at Molly curled up at my feet, the only creature in that house who loved me without a price tag, and I realized that if I kept my mouth shut any longer, I would die in this basement as an unpaid servant. The rage didn't come hot. It came cold and sharp. I closed my laptop and began making a list of my own. Not of errands, but of exactly what they owed me. The next morning was a performance. I watched my father, Arthur, check the Louis Vuitton bags while my mother adjusted her Hermes scarf. Neither of them bothered to look me in the eye. My brother was busy filming Vance Family Legacy Trip videos for social media, walking past me like I was a piece of furniture. My mother only paused at the door to remind me not to forget the distilled water for the orchids because they were expensive. When the heavy oak door clicked shut and the sound of the engine faded down the driveway, the silence in the house was suffocating. I looked at those delicate, demanding plants on the windowsill and smiled. From this moment on, I would never let myself be invisible again. The house was so quiet that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a sound that usually got buried under my mother's constant critiques and the loud, self-important phone calls my brother would make from the living room sofa. I walked through the foyer, past the mahogany side table where a Ladro figurine sat, a piece I now realized was likely paid for with my own tax-deferred earnings, and I headed straight for my father's study, a room I had been told was off-limits for my entire adult life. I stood at the threshold of that room, looking at the executive leather chair and the rows of hardbound engineering journals, and I realized that I had kept my mouth shut for 15 years because I was afraid that speaking up would make me the difficult daughter, the one who ruined the perfect suburban image my parents had spent decades cultivating. I think most of us who grew up in families that demanded total loyalty know that feeling, where you tell yourself your silence is a form of love, a way to protect the people who raised you, until one day you realize your silence was actually just a permission slip for them to erase you. I sat down at Arthur's desk, the air smelling of expensive tobacco and old paper, and I began to pull open the drawers that held the secrets of our family's financial ruin. My hands were steady as I sorted through the files, my eyes trained by years of managing multi-million-dollar clinical research budgets to look for the discrepancies that others might miss. And it didn't take long before I found the folder labeled Vance Estate 2019. Inside, nestled between old property tax assessments, was the notarized power of attorney document that bore my signature in a script that looked almost exactly like mine, but with a slight tremor in the capital J that I knew I had never made. I sat there thinking, they didn't just take my money, they took my agency. Using a forged legal instrument to bind me to their lifestyle inflation while I was downstairs in the dark, calculating the p-values of life-saving drugs and worrying if I had enough in my checking account to cover the HOA fees they always forgot to pay. I felt a wave of nausea as I realized the depth of the unacknowledged sacrifice I had made. Remembering the 5 years I spent as the primary caregiver for my grandmother while my mother, Margaret, was out at charity luncheons or country club events, claiming she was too sensitive to handle the reality of aging. I had been the one to lift her, to bathe her, and to hold her hand during the terrifying nights when she forgot where she was, all while my parents told me that family doesn't charge family for the labor of love. And I think most women who have raised a family or cared for an aging parent know exactly what it means to reach the end of your rope and realize the people you did it for never once stopped to ask if you were okay, or if you had any dreams of your own that were being buried under the weight of their expectations. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed a number I hadn't called in nearly a decade. A woman named Diane, who had gone from being my undergraduate roommate to a senior partner at a top-tier Chicago law firm. When she answered, her voice was warm but sharp, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has seen the worst of human nature in a courtroom and still chooses to fight for what is right. I told her everything about the European cruise, the $67,000 in credit card debt, and the forged power of attorney. And I could hear the silence on the other end of the line as she processed the sheer scale of the identity theft my own parents had committed. She didn't offer me platitudes or tell me it would be okay. She asked me if I was ready to stop being a daughter for a moment so I could start being a plaintiff. Because under Illinois law, what they had done wasn't just a family dispute. It was a Class 1 felony. I looked out the window at the snow piling up on the driveway. The same snow my mother expected me to shovel so that the neighbors wouldn't think the house was empty. And I felt a sudden, sharp clarity that I had never experienced before. I told Diane that I didn't want them in prison, but I wanted them to feel the weight of what they had taken, to understand that the invisible daughter in the basement was the only thing keeping their manicured world from collapsing into the dirt. We spent the next 2 hours on the phone, mapping out a plan that involved a forensic accountant and a mechanic's lien, a legal strategy that would effectively freeze their ability to hide behind their home equity until every cent they had stolen from me was accounted for. By the time I hung up, the sun was beginning to set over the Oak Brook skyline, casting long blue shadows across the snow, and I walked back down to my basement room with a manila folder clutched to my chest, knowing that the obedient dog my mother thought she left behind was gone, replaced by a woman who finally knew her own value. I spent the rest of the evening packing my things into discreet cardboard boxes, moving with a quiet efficiency that I had honed through years of laboratory management, making sure that nothing I did would alert the neighbors or the Hendersons next door that I was preparing to leave. Every item I owned, the few designer clothes I had bought for industry conferences, my medical textbooks, and the leather-bound journal Grandma had given me before she died, fit into less than 10 boxes, a heartbreakingly small tally for a woman of 39. I looked at the yellow walls and the concrete floor, a space where I had spent my most productive years in a state of arrested development, and I realized that my parents hadn't just used my credit score. They had used my time, the one finite resource that no amount of money could ever buy back. As I loaded the first box into the back of my SUV under the cover of darkness, Molly watched me with her head cocked to the side, her tail giving a single, slow wag, as if she understood that we were finally moving toward a life where the windows were real and the air was our own to breathe. The next morning, I drove to a small, nondescript accounting firm in Naperville, far enough away from the prying eyes of our neighbors in Oak Brook to feel safe, carrying a heavy folder of every financial statement I had managed to intercept over the last 48 hours. I sat across from a man named Marcus, a forensic accountant with silver hair and the kind of patient, weary eyes that had seen decades of familial financial abuse hidden behind white picket fences and Ivy League diplomas. I watched as he spread my life out across his desk in columns of red and black, his pen moving with a clinical precision as he highlighted the $67,000 in credit card debt that I hadn't known existed until 2 days ago. He looked up at me, his expression softening just a fraction, and told me that while I was working 60-hour weeks managing multi-center clinical trials for life-saving oncology drugs, my father had been using my identity to secure a revolving line of credit that funded a failed startup venture for my brother, a venture I was never even told existed. I think most of us have gotten a phone call or a piece of mail that split our life into before and after. The kind where you have to sit down without planning to, and afterward the room looks different, and you realize that the people who were supposed to be your safety net have actually been the ones cutting the ropes. I sat there in that small office, the hum of a desktop printer the only sound in the room, and realized that my father, Arthur, had systematically drained the equity I had built through my contributions to the household expenses to bail my brother out of a legal settlement involving a reckless driving charge in Manhattan. My brother, Grant, had been living a life of luxury rentals and high-end bottle service on my billable hours, while I was skipping dental appointments and driving a 10-year-old sedan because I thought we were struggling as a family. My parents had looked me in the eye every Sunday dinner, praising my dedication and my selflessness, while they were actively signing my name to legal documents that ensured I would be legally responsible for their poor choices and my brother's entitlement. I stood there thinking, he looked me in the eye in that living room, put his hand on my shoulder, and swore he was so proud of the woman I had become, while he was secretly using my Social Security number to pay for my brother's luxury engagement ring. If you think you know what it feels like to watch your own family lie to your face about your whole life while they use you as an ATM, tell me if you would have stayed quiet as long as I did. Like and subscribe, because the bank records I found tucked inside an old recipe box that afternoon told a very different story about where our family's loyalty really lied. Marcus flipped to the final page of his preliminary report, his voice dropping to a low, steady register as he pointed to a wire transfer that had occurred just 3 days before they left for the European river cruise. It was a transfer of $15,000 from my savings account, the one I had set aside for my own retirement, directly into my brother's checking account to cover his overdue property taxes on a condo I didn't even know he owned. My mother, Margaret, had actually sat at the kitchen table with me that same evening, complaining about the cost of Molly's veterinary care and asking if I could pitch in a little extra this month for the grocery bill. I realized then that their irrational act wasn't just a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a total negation of our bond, a decision to treat their only daughter as a commodity to be traded for their son's comfort. I left the office and sat in my car for a long time, watching the commuter trains rush past the station, feeling a sense of profound isolation that made the cold winter air feel even sharper. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent in that basement, the unacknowledged sacrifices I had made to ensure my parents could maintain their social standing, and I realized that they had never seen me as a person, only as a resource. Most of us who grew up in families like that know what it means to keep your mouth shut at the dinner table, not because you have nothing to say, but because you've learned that the truth is an inconvenience to the people who are supposed to love you most. I picked up my phone and saw a notification from our family group chat, a photo of my brother holding a glass of champagne on the deck of a ship in Lien, with a caption from my mother saying, "So blessed to have my boys here with me." A message that was a direct strike to my reputation and standing as a member of that family. I didn't reply to the message, and I didn't call to confront them. Instead, I drove back to the Oak Brook house and walked straight to the circuit breaker in the basement, the one I had paid a licensed electrician $3,000 to upgrade last summer. I stood there in the dark, the faint smell of damp concrete and old cardboard surrounding me, and I realized that the power in this house, both literally and figuratively, belonged to me. I took out my laptop and sent a single encrypted email to Diane, giving her the green light to file the mechanics lien on the property, a legal maneuver that would prevent them from ever refinancing or selling the house without my express written consent. I was no longer the daughter waiting for permission to exist. I was the lien holder on their American dream, and I was going to make sure that by the time they returned from their European vacation, the world they thought they owned had already begun to shift beneath them. I walked back upstairs to the room that used to belong to my grandmother, a space that still held the faint, lingering scent of lavender sachet and unscented moisturizing lotion. And I sat on the edge of the bed where I had spent hundreds of nights reading to her until she fell asleep. It was the only room in this 4,000 square foot house where I never felt like an employee or an inconvenience, because my grandmother had a way of looking at me that made me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, even when the rest of the family treated me like a temporary fixture. I remember her hands, thin, translucent skin over knuckles that had spent 70 years kneading bread dough for Sunday dinners and sewing baptismal gowns for every new baby in the family, and the way she would squeeze my hand when she couldn't find the words anymore. A quiet, unremarkable kind of love that never needed a thank you note or a public acknowledgement. I think most of us who have cared for someone at the end of their life know that specific kind of tenderness, the sort that exists in the silence of a darkened room at 3 a.m, where the only thing that matters is the rhythm of another person's breathing and the unspoken promise that you won't let them go through the dark alone. I sat there in the fading afternoon light, my fingers tracing the pattern on the handmade quilt she had finished the year I graduated from college, and I realized that I had kept my mouth shut for 11 years because I told myself I was doing it for her, to keep the peace so she could die in the house she loved. I had convinced myself that my silence was a sacred sacrifice, a way to shield her from the knowledge that my mother, her own daughter, was more interested in the estate appraisal than in the woman who had raised her. Most of us who grew up in families that valued keeping the peace know exactly what it costs when you make that calculation. You spend your life holding your breath so that no one else has to feel the tension. And you wake up one day to realize you've forgotten how to breathe for yourself. I had stayed in that basement because I thought my presence was the only thing holding the family legacy together. But as I looked at the empty cherry wood dresser where her jewelry box used to sit, I realized my parents had already begun dismantling that legacy before she was even in the ground. I opened the top drawer of the nightstand and found something they had missed: a small, leather-bound recipe box with my grandmother's name embossed in gold on the lid, filled with hundreds of handwritten cards that smelled of cinnamon and nutmeg. This box was supposed to be mine, a legacy and memory that my grandmother had promised me during those long nights when we talked about the past. Yet I had found a listing on a local estate auction site just an hour ago, showing that my mother had already photographed the rest of the bedroom set to be sold while they were away. They weren't just stealing my credit score or my billable hours as a clinical director. They were erasing the dignity of the woman who had built this family, selling off her most precious belongings to fund my brother's legal fees and their own Mediterranean habits. It was the final negation of everything she had worked for, a decision to treat our family's history as nothing more than liquid assets to be consumed and discarded. I thought about my father, the man who used to teach me how to calculate structural loads on my homework assignments, and how he had become someone who could look at a forged signature on a property line and feel no shame as long as the check cleared. He had spent 30 years as a structural engineer, building bridges and buildings that were meant to last for a century. But he had failed to build a foundation of trust within his own walls, choosing instead to let my brother Grant act as a wrecking ball to everything we had saved. I think most women who have raised a family know this feeling. You see exactly what's happening. You've seen it for years, and you stay quiet because you tell yourself your silence is protecting the people you love, until you realize that your silence has only become the oxygen that allows the fire to grow. I stood up and took the recipe box with me, the weight of it feeling more solid and real than anything else in that hollowed-out house. And I walked down the hallway past the portraits of my parents, looking prosperous and composed in their country club whites. I realized that my Aunt Martha was the only one who had ever really seen the truth, the only one who had tried to warn me about the inheritance dispute that had been brewing since the day my grandmother's health began to fail. Aunt Martha had been silenced by my mother's threats of social exclusion, but she had still managed to leave me that one small checking account that allowed me to pay the security deposit on my new apartment, a quiet act of resistance that I only now fully understood. I walked down to the kitchen and made myself a cup of peppermint tea, sitting at the oak table where so many family meals had taken place. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The house feels different now, no longer a sanctuary or a home, but a collection of assets that I was legally disentangling myself from. And as I watched the first snowflakes of the season begin to drift past the window, I felt a sense of quiet strength settled over me. I wasn't just leaving a basement. I was reclaiming the dignity that my parents had tried to strip away from me and from my grandmother, and I was doing it with the same precision and care that I brought to my medical research. By the time the Vance family returned from their European trip, they would find the orchids dead, the driveway unshoveled, and the invisible daughter gone. But they would also find a legal reality that they couldn't ignore. A manifesto of accountability that would finally force them to see the woman I had become in the shadows they had created. I stood in the middle of the stainless steel kitchen, the sub-zero refrigerator humming like a taunt in the silence, and I finally picked up my phone to see the Instagram story my brother had just posted from a sun-drenched vineyard in southern France. He was laughing, his arm draped around my mother's shoulders, both of them holding glasses of vintage Bordeaux that were likely purchased using the interest-only line of credit that had just decimated my debt-to-income ratio and destroyed my ability to qualify for a home loan for at least the next decade. I thought about my brother, Grant, who had always been the family's golden investment, the one whose private school tuition and unpaid internships were treated as necessary expenses, while my own advanced degree was seen as a personal indulgence that I should fund myself. I had spent 15 years working my way up to a senior director level position, sacrificing my sleep and my social life to build a spotless reputation in oncology research, only to discover that my father, Arthur, had used my professional standing as a secret guarantor for a commercial lease on a luxury boutique that my brother had abandoned and left in default 6 months ago. He was smiling in a custom-tailored wool coat that cost more than my monthly student loan payment, standing on a cobblestone street in Strasbourg, while I was here calculating how many years of clinical medical research it would take to scrub the fraud from my name. If that breaks something in you the way it broke something in me, tell me if this sounds like someone you know. Like and subscribe, because what I found out next about how long my own father had been hiding the legal notices from the bank is something I still can't say without stopping. I sat at the breakfast nook, the same place where I had prepared thousands of meals for them, while they discussed their investment portfolios as if I were a hired contractor who happened to share their last name. And I looked at the certified mail I had intercepted from the clerk of court. My mother, Margaret, had always been the one to handle the household correspondence, and I realized now that she had spent years filtering out the delinquency notices and the legal summons that were addressed to me, ensuring that I remained invisible to the reality of my own financial life. She had looked me in the eye every morning and asked me to pick up her prescription refills or drop off her dry cleaning, all while she was purposefully burying me in $67,000 of revolving debt to keep my brother from facing the consequences of his own failures. I think most women who have raised a family and kept their feelings quiet for decades know this feeling. You tell yourself you are the glue holding everything together, that your unrewarded giving is the only thing keeping the family from falling apart, until you realize you were never the glue. You were the foundation they were slowly stripping for parts. The irrationality of it all was what made my skin crawl. They didn't just take the money because they were desperate. They took it because they felt entitled to my life, believing that as my parents, they owned my future as much as they owned the Oak Brook house. They had destroyed the dignity in old age that I was trying to build for myself, treating my senior-level salary as a family reserve fund that existed solely to protect my brother's unearned reputation in the high-end real estate market. I thought about the phone calls I had received from landlords and loan officers over the years, the confused apologies, the rejections that I thought were just bad luck. And I realized that every no I had ever received was a direct result of the yes my parents had given themselves with my social security number. Most of us have gotten a phone call that split our life into before and after. But this was a slow-motion realization that my entire adult life had been a carefully constructed trap, and the people I loved most were the ones who had set the spring. I looked at the family Bible on the mantle, the one where my name was recorded right beneath my brother's, and I realized that to them, I was just a secondary character in his success story, a safety net that they could shred whenever he needed a softer place to land. I picked up the manila envelope containing the mechanic's lien and the sworn affidavits from the forensic accountant, and I felt a sense of quiet, earned anger that made my hands as steady as a surgeon's. I wasn't just filing a legal claim. I was reclaiming the years of silence and the unacknowledged sacrifices I had made. And I was doing it with the full knowledge that this choice would likely end the family I had spent my whole life trying to save. I walked out of the kitchen and toward the foyer, the grand staircase looming over me like a monument to the lies they had told. And I knew that the Vance family was about to face a reckoning that no amount of European luxury could ever fix. The days leading up to their return were filled with a cold, clinical precision that I had learned from years of managing FDA-regulated research trials. A quiet efficiency that allowed me to move my entire life out of that basement without leaving a single footprint behind. I spent my billable hours coordinating with the forensic accountant and my legal counsel, ensuring that every forged signature and every unauthorized wire transfer was documented and ready to be presented as a legal demand for restitution. I think most of us who grew up in families that valued keeping the peace know what it means to keep your mouth shut at the dinner table. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you've learned that your voice is an inconvenience to the people who are supposed to protect you. I sat at that kitchen table for the last time, looking at the granite countertops and the high-end appliances that I had helped pay for. And I realized that my silence hadn't been a form of loyalty. It had been a subsidy for their deception, a way for them to maintain a social standing in Oak Brook that was built entirely on my sacrificed future. I found a folder in my mother's writing desk on the penultimate day of their trip, a blue, leather-bound binder labeled Transition Plan that revealed the final, most irrational act of all. They were planning to sell the Oak Brook house in the spring and move to a luxury retirement community in Naples, Florida. They had already scouted a one-bedroom studio apartment for me in a dilapidated part of town, a place they described in their notes as affordable and practical for her needs, while they planned to use the liquidation of the family estate to fund my brother's down payment on a $1 million brownstone in Lincoln Park. They weren't just using my credit score to fund their present. They were actively engineering my displacement, planning to discard me like a depreciated asset once I was no longer useful for their property tax deductions and household labor. I stood there thinking, they were going to sell the roof over my head using the very equity I had built, and they were going to leave me in a rented room while my brother, Grant, walked away with the legacy I had spent 15 years trying to preserve. I think most women who have raised a family and kept their feelings quiet for decades know this feeling. You see exactly what's happening. You've seen the favoritism and the unacknowledged sacrifices for years, and you stay quiet because you tell yourself your patience will eventually be rewarded with recognition. But as I looked at the blueprints for their new life in Florida, a life that didn't include a room for the daughter who had cared for their parents and paid their bills, I realized that recognition was a currency they were never going to trade in. The injustice of it hit me with a physical weight, a realization that my parents, Arthur and Margaret, had never intended for me to have a seat at the table they had built with my billable hours, and that the only way to get their attention was to disrupt the very foundation of the world they thought they controlled. My phone buzzed with a text from my brother, asking if I had finished the prep work for the New Year's Day brunch, a message that included a photo of a 5-star seafood tower they were enjoying in Paris, while I was standing in a house that was technically encumbered by my legal filings. I didn't feel the need to argue or explain. I simply typed back a neutral confirmation and went back to my packing, knowing that the invitation-based engagement they expected from me was a relic of a daughter who no longer existed. The lawyer put 2 folders on the table in that small conference room in downtown Chicago and told me I had until Monday morning to decide which one would determine the rest of my life and my family's future. If you've ever had to make a choice like that, where you have to choose between your own survival and the reputation of the people who raised you, tell me what you would have done. Like and subscribe. Because I sat in my car in that parking lot for 2 hours, and I almost chose the wrong one. I spent the final night before their return in my new studio apartment, a space that was small but filled with actual sunlight, and a sense of privacy that I hadn't felt since I moved back into the basement 10 years ago. I looked at Molly asleep on her new orthopedic bed, her breathing steady and peaceful. And I realized that we were finally in a place where no one was going to ask us to be invisible or expendable for the sake of someone else's luxury. I thought about the New Year's Day brunch, the 40 guests from the Oak Brook Country Club, and the carefully curated image my mother was planning to project. And I felt a sense of calm, earned dignity that made the rage of the previous week feel like a distant memory. I wasn't going to show up to cater their event or to serve their guests. I was going to show up as a creditor, a woman who was finally ready to collect on the debt of a lifetime of unacknowledged labor and stolen identity. And I was going to do it in front of every single person who had ever looked at the Vance family and seen only perfection. The morning of the New Year's Day brunch arrived with a bitter Midwestern chill that rattled the window panes of my new studio apartment. But for the first time in my life, I didn't wake up with the weight of their expectations crushing the air out of my lungs. I sat at my small bistro table with a cup of black coffee, watching the steam rise against the winter sunlight. And I thought about the 40 guests who were currently pulling into the circular driveway in Oak Brook, expecting to find me in a stained apron, preparing eggs Benedict and smoked salmon canapes. I think most of us who grew up in families that valued keeping the peace know exactly what it costs when you make that calculation. You spend your life being the reliable one, the one who shows up and sacrifices while everyone else takes the credit. And you realize that your silence hasn't been protecting the family. It has only been protecting their delusions. I looked at Molly, who was waiting patiently by the door, her leather leash already in my hand. And I realized that the only way to restore the family's dignity was to finally tell the truth in a room where they couldn't pretend I didn't exist. I arrived at the house at 10:45, just as the mimosa bar was in full swing and the Hendersons were at one of my brother's exaggerated stories about their time in Lien. I didn't go through the garage or the servants' entrance. I walked straight to the front door, wearing a sharp black blazer and tailored slacks that I had bought with my own hard-earned salary, and I let the heavy brass knocker echo through the foyer. When my father, Arthur, opened the door, his face tightened with a mixture of confusion and irritation, his eyes darting to the guests behind him before landing on the manila envelope clutched in my hand. He tried to usher me toward the study, his voice a low, dangerous whisper, as he told me I was embarrassing my mother. But I simply stepped past him into the great room, where 40 of the most prominent people in Oak Brook were standing under the crystal chandelier. My mother, Margaret, froze in the middle of a sentence, her hostess smile cracking like old porcelain as she saw me standing there. Not as the invisible daughter who was supposed to be in the kitchen, but as a woman who had finally decided to reclaim her seat at the table. I felt the entire room go silent, the tinkling of glassware and the low murmur of conversation dying away as I walked to the center of the room, Molly trotting beside me with a quiet, earned confidence. I think most women who have raised a family know this feeling, where you realize that the unspoken rules you've followed for decades are the very things that have been keeping you small, and for the first time, you are no longer afraid of the noise your truth might make. I looked at my mother and told her, clearly and calmly, that I wasn't there to cater her brunch. I was there to deliver a legal notice of accountability for the 15 years of labor and the $67,000 of identity theft that had funded the very champagne her guests were currently sipping. I handed the manila envelope to her, and I watched as her manicured hands began to shake, her eyes scanning the forensic accountant's report and the mechanic's lien that was now a public record on their $4 million estate. My father snatched the papers from her, his face turning a deep, mottled red as he saw the affidavits documenting the forged power of attorney he had used to steal my retirement savings for my brother's legal settlements. The whispers began almost instantly, a hissing sound that filled the room as the guests realized that the Vance family's wealth and standing were built on the systematic exploitation of their own daughter. Tell me if you would have stayed quiet as long as I did, or if you think I made the right call by forcing them to see the cost of their luxury in front of the people they were trying so hard to impress. Like and subscribe. Because what my Aunt Martha did next, stepping out from the corner of the room to stand beside me, was the one thing my parents never saw coming. Martha had been standing near the fireplace, watching the scene with an expression of quiet, weary pride. And when she spoke, her voice carried across the room with the authority of a woman who was done being intimidated by her own family. She told the room that she had known about the credit cards and the forged signatures for years, but that my mother had threatened to exclude her from the family trust if she ever told me the truth. I looked at my Aunt Martha, the woman who had quietly paid for my professional certifications behind my parents' backs, and I realized that I hadn't been as alone as I thought. I had just been living in a culture of silence that she was finally helping me break. My brother, Grant, tried to intervene, his voice shrill with entitlement as he told me I was ruining everything. But I simply looked at him and realized he was just a symptom of the rot that my parents had allowed to grow in the foundation of our home. One by one, the guests began to set down their glasses and head for the cloakroom, the embarrassed silence of the room more powerful than any shouted argument could have been. They didn't want to be part of the reckoning, but they couldn't look away from the evidence that their friends were not the people they pretended to be. By the time the Hendersons walked out the door without saying goodbye, the house felt hollow and cold, the perfume and champagne smells replaced by the bitter scent of a legacy in ruins. I stood in that grand foyer one last time, looking at my parents as they sat on their designer furniture, clutching the legal documents that proved they were debtors to their own child, and I felt a sense of peace that was as solid as the Oak Brook soil. I didn't need their apology or their recognition anymore. I had my own billable hours, my own spotless reputation, and a future that was finally, legally, and undeniably my own. My father, Arthur, sat on the edge of that custom-made designer sofa, the legal summons fluttering in his hand as the last guest closed the door. And for the first time in his career as a structural engineer, he didn't have a plan to fix the collapsed foundation of his own reputation. He had spent 40 years ensuring that the buildings he designed would never lean or crack, yet he had ignored the stress fractures in his own daughter until the entire structure of his life finally came down around him. Within 90 days, the Vance estate in Oak Brook was quietly listed for sale to cover the $67,000 in credit card fraud and the $100,000 second mortgage. But because of the mechanics lien I had placed on the title, they were legally barred from touching a single cent of the equity until every dollar was returned to my retirement accounts. My mother, Margaret, resigned from the Oak Brook charity board she had chaired for a decade, unable to face the quiet whispers at the grocery store or the cold stares in the church pews once the truth about their identity theft became the neighborhood's most talked about legacy and memory. My brother, Grant, lost his luxury real estate licensing after an ethics investigation into his defaulted commercial leases was triggered by my legal filings. And for the first time in his 34 years, he had to find a job that didn't depend on my forged signature. I moved into a 3-bedroom townhome in a quiet corner of Hinsdale with actual floor-to-ceiling windows, a place where the sunlight hits the hardwood floor at exactly 4 o'clock every afternoon and makes Molly's fur look like spun gold as she sleeps. I was promoted to Chief Research Officer at my biotech firm, a position that came with the senior-level salary I had actually been earning for years. But the real recovery wasn't the money. It was the uninterrupted silence of a home that belonged entirely to me. My credit score began its slow, steady climb back into the 800s, finally scrubbed clean of the delinquencies and the defaults that had kept me invisible and trapped in that basement for over a decade. I even managed to recover my grandmother's cherry wood dresser from the estate auction, placing it in my own bedroom, where it stands as a testimony to the dignity of the woman who truly loved me. My parents paid for their luxury European vacation with my future, but in the end, they discovered that social standing is a very expensive loan that can never be repaid with a forged signature. The house they worked so hard to project as a monument to success was revealed to be a hollow shell, built on the unacknowledged labor of the daughter they thought they could discard. I stood in front of the mirror in my new hallway and realized that for 15 years, I wasn't protecting my family from the truth. I was protecting them from the consequences of who they really were. I think most of us who grew up in families that valued keeping the peace know this feeling. You realize that your silence wasn't an act of love. It was a prison you built for yourself. And the moment you step out of it, the world finally looks the way it was always supposed to. I have my morning coffee on my back porch every morning now, and the only sounds I hear are the ones I choose to let in. The birds, the neighbor's dog, the wind in the trees, and I am no longer afraid of what the phone might say. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and like and subscribe, because there is always someone sitting quietly in a house somewhere right now, holding something painful they have never said out loud. And maybe this is the story that helps them understand they are not alone.